On the show today, we'll discuss how technology can be a game changer for agriculture in Africa. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets. You can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther Ubudaga. Now, across Africa, we've seen organizations investing in technology to drive innovation in agriculture, from climate smart techniques to the use of biotechnology. We explore how technology can be a game changer for the future of agriculture in Africa. My guests for this discussion are Kola Masha, Managing Director, Babban, Gona, and Onyeka, Akumah, co-founder and CEO of Farmcrowdy. Thank you, gentlemen. Pleasure to have you on the show today. Now, let's talk about the state of agriculture first before we move on to all that smart technology that's been deployed that's disrupting the space. Now, for decades, many African governments have put out many policy instruments to help improve farm productivity, but that's still a major issue here because if you look across the board, at least for many parts of Africa, farm yield is still quite low. And I'm thinking especially in the rural areas, and then there's the issue of, it's just a whole bunch of challenges. There's the climate side of things, desertification, at least for the farmers in Nigeria, for example, moving southwards because, they can't find pasture for their cattle. So I'm just thinking, for you, how would you describe, let me start with you, Kola, state of agriculture, all these policy instruments, how they've been able to improve farm productivity?
Well, I think we have seen progress in farm productivity over the years. The question is whether it's fast enough. And I think the fundamental fact is that if you look at the smallholder farmer in Nigeria today, they struggle with really four key challenges. The first is they don't have access to the capital they need to buy the quantity and quality of products to be successful. Even if they have that capital, they often have to travel 10, 20, 30 kilometers to buy products from a guy who bought it from a guy who bought it from a guy. And so they're paying ridiculously high prices for those products. Oftentimes they're adulterated or fake. You're buying fertilizer that's river sand, you're buying expired chemicals, or you're buying seeds that actually are just grains. And then on top of that, through that supply chain, they struggle to access the information they need to use those inputs successfully. And oftentimes they misuse them. Despite their hard work, they tend to get yields that are somewhere around 20% of other farmers in similar developing countries. Now, the final challenge they face is at harvest time. They're under tremendous cash flow pressure. And this causes them to sell a significant portion of their harvest at those low prices at harvest. When if they could just wait 3, 4, maybe 5 months, they could often get 20 to 40% better pricing. So all of this compounds to really keep the smallholder farmer, not just in Nigeria, but around sub-Saharan Africa, in this cycle of poverty.
Onyeka, let me hear your thoughts. When one thinks about the population growth in Africa, you've seen some of the statistics. By the year 2050, we could have up to 2 billion people in Africa. Yeah. And of course, farm productivity is not ahead of that population growth. What are your thoughts in terms of how all these policies in general have been able to help us get ahead of the curve, as it were, but not successful?
Not successful because of the timing yet. I think eventually what will happen is, over time, we will catch up. The policies are put in place, if they can be sustained over one administration to the next administration, and there's a lot of continuity across Africa from government to government, then gradually those policies will then start turning into action plans that are then implemented from one administration to the next, and gradually we'll start seeing the agriculture space take its own stage and take its own turn in sustainability for us in Africa. I think also the other fundamental problem is that Africa is growing really, really fast. And so anyone putting any policy in place has to think 3 times, 4 times faster than the population growth. And so in designing policies and implementing those policies, one has to, just like Kola mentioned, one has to take into consideration how fast everything is growing in Africa and implement them as fast as possible to catch up. The other thing is we may start looking at opportunities around drawing in the private sector to get involved in also policy making. Because from the private sector's angle of doing business, it's all about profit driven and profit margins and timing. And if that level of acceptance from state governments to get the private sector to influence these policies comes into play, you will start seeing many of the policies implemented faster. You start seeing the private sector take ownership for what happens within their domain, and maybe gradually we start catching up.
And of course, definitely there will be things will go fast. I'm happy Onyeka brought up that point. I was going to ask that question. The private sector, are we not giving not enough incentives for the private sector to come in? Because obviously, when it's the government, it's slower, and then there's the issue of political will, red tape, bureaucracy, and all of that. So I'm thinking, what is that missing link to get the private? What is it that we need to move that needle to get the private sector better involved?
Well, I think there's two parts to it. One is the incentive, but then the other piece is also a disincentive. Oftentimes, what you find is government policy can sometimes actually disincentivize private sector investment in the agriculture sector. Because what happens is you have policies where the government provides certain incentives or certain programs, but oftentimes what the government does is they run those programs as parallel structures to the private sector. And what that creates is a scenario where you actually crowd out the private sector. A specific example is if you look at the three main agricultural inputs today, you have fertilizer, seeds, and agrochemicals. The agrochemical space has been completely deregulated. Government has not really been involved in providing any incentives or programs through that. That part of the value chain is one of the strongest, most diversified, most competitive parts of the value chain. If you look at seed sector, which has had a tremendous amount of government intervention over the years, it is still in a very nascent phase because private sector organizations have not been willing to invest in that area because they don't know if the government might crowd them out. And similar situations also to a lesser degree in the fertilizer space.
So are you saying that the government doesn't understand the need to take the back seat and allow the private sector?
Well, I think
because I would imagine there's so many stakeholder engagement with the private sector, and I'm just thinking, I mean, if the facts are there, why not go that route?
Well, I think oftentimes agriculture is seen as a tool to garner support from the population, and
okay,
so government wants
political angle to
exactly. So government wants to ensure that the efforts that they're making are being able to be attributed directly to them, which is reasonable,
so that they can take credit, basically.
Which is reasonable, right? But I think oftentimes that creates a disservice to the long-term growth of the organization. I think perfect example is the fertilizer subsidy program that has been run in the country for many years. Now I think the government has taken a slightly more proactive approach by trying to channel the benefits through private sector actors. But government basically set up its own parallel distribution system to provide subsidized fertilizer. So if you are a seller of fertilizer, oftentimes you could actually not even sell your fertilizer. The price that the government fertilizer was coming into the market was cheaper than what you could buy from the company. So it just made it completely uneconomical for those actors.
Would you like to add to that?
I think it's just strongly buttresses my point. Also, if you look at disbursement of funds to the farmers, recently, I mean, from my experience working with some of the rural farmers we've worked with, every time they sense government involved in the process of funding their farms, they call it the national cake. And what they are excited about is the opportunity to also get some money to go and do one or two other things beyond just running the farm. And every time we then engage with them, we approach them and say, we are a business and we're in this business to make money for not just for you, but also our stakeholders. And so you have to take responsibility for what we're giving to you. And in designing also our model, we reduce how much cash involvement how much cash we give to the farmers at the end of the day, and then turn that cash into more of the inputs they get while monitoring them through the process. It takes a private company like us to design models because we are sitting with these farmers and we understand that we have to turn a profit at the end of the day. And so we will do everything we can to work with the farmers to make their lives better, but at the same time make sure we are making something for our stakeholders. In that level of involvement with the farmers, we bring our own private sector way of doing business. If the government approaches farmers and agriculture in a similar manner in association with other private sector playholders, then you will start seeing the growth.
You know, it's quite funny because I always remember the previous agric minister, the way he came and tried to, I mean, obviously there was a major transformation. And he said that what he wanted to leave behind was for the agriculture sector in Nigeria to be treated as or like a business. Would you say that legacy is still there today?
I think that legacy is still there. So I want to make sure I give credit to certain organizations that are actually trying to ensure that their policy interventions don't crowd out the private sector. So for example, you've got the central bank that has both the Anchor Borrower Program and the Commercial Agricultural Credit Scheme today that is specifically targeted to support organizations that are in turn supporting smallholder farmers and ensuring that they're able to create a pipeline of capital to those types of organizations. In addition, I think it's very noteworthy that organizations like Bank of Industry are now aggressively getting into this space as well with their Jeep program. So I think the good news is that we're starting to see policy that can be more catalytic versus actually impacting the sector.
Okay, so basically we're still on the right path despite the hiccups here and there.
Yes.
Now, okay, let's move this along now. For the farmer, for today's farmer, information is key, and the way that information is passed across now is now different. Because of technology, we're now trying to use technology to scale and to leapfrog. And there's a lot of innovation that's come on stream now. FarmCrowdy, you're one. You're also a good example. We've heard about soil technology. We've heard about the use of satellites. We've heard about the use of solar. I've heard of solar fridges, etc. So help us share your thoughts on how technology is now transforming the space, specifically referring to one or two examples.
Okay, the first example I'll give is my own example with FarmCrowdy. When Kola mentioned the problems farmers face, the first problem is access to funds and funds to scale up their farms. And what we've done with FarmCrowd is we've identified the interest from many Nigerians that want to invest in agriculture to come through our platform to now sponsor farmers. And in sponsoring the farmer gets all he needs to go through a full cycle, including inputs, fertilizer, seed, labor costs, tractors, also the cost of getting the technical field specialists to train and guide the farmer throughout the farming process is factored into that sponsorship. And then the third problem he mentioned, or the fourth problem he mentioned, which is access to markets to sell and make a decent margin from farming, is something we also tidy up, where we get the right market to buy up the harvest at the end of the season, or at the end of the season after we've warehoused to make some more margins as a result of that, and then split the profit with the farmers. Now, to the farmers that we've worked with, they're excited about the model because now they don't have to go to, but they come as cooperatives, they come as a group, and now they have access to funds, and the funds get the input, and then they get the training, and then there's a market to sell, and then they make something at the end of the cycle. That's maybe one example of it as concerns financing farmers. There's also the Uber for tractors, Hello Tractor, that assembles, aggregates all the tractor providers across different places, and now with their technology, their mobile app and their web app, you can now order for tractor services across different geopolitical areas of the country. That's maybe another example. There are smart farming techniques, there are information dissemination softwares, including stuff like USSD codes that you can use to reach the farmers at basic level, where you're passing information you gather across the research that has happened in different institutions and pass it on to the farmers, from monitoring the weather to soil tests to understanding what they should expect in terms of yield.
Onyeka, hold that thought for us. I want us to talk about climate change when we come. Kola, hold that. Thank you for your time so far, gentlemen. We'll take a quick break. I'll come back and pick up from where we left off. I've been speaking to Kola Masha, Managing Director, Babban, Gona, and Onyeka, Akumah, co-founder and CEO of FarmCrowd, looking at how technology is disrupting the agriculture. Still with me in the studio are Kola Masha, Managing Director, Babban, Gona, and Onyeka, Akumah, co-founder and CEO of FarmCrowdy, and we're discussing technology as a game changer for Africa's agriculture. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time so far. Kola, let me start with you. Climate change, that's a big issue for farmers now. We talked earlier about how it's affecting cattle herders in the northern part of the country. But let's hear your own experience with your farmers in Babban, Gona, how you are able to stay ahead of major climate incidences and getting the farmers informed as it went to you.
So I think So first we need to understand what's the key impact of climate change on farmers. And in the Nigerian context, that is where basically the weather is less predictable than it used to be. So farmers used to know very reliably when they could plant or when they could apply their fertilizer or their herbicides or so on and so forth, because they knew when the rains stabilized. What you're finding now is that that's becoming significantly less predictable. In just our experience over the last 7 years, we've seen situations where the rainy season has started as early as late April to as late as mid-June. And so I think one of the key things that we are trying to do is to provide certain technology to the farmers that helps mitigate that risk. The first piece is really around ensuring they have the right technology, particularly around drought-tolerant seeds. If they have a drought-tolerant seed, even if they plant it and the rains haven't actually stabilized, what happens is that seed will remain dormant and then actually once the rains do stabilize, will actually now take off. So that helps significantly. Other areas that we're looking at is now leveraging some of today the proliferations of different constellations of satellites and technology that one can get through remote sensing is tremendous. And so there's now opportunity where you can actually leverage satellite technology to assess the level of moisture in the soil and provide the farmer a reliable prediction of now is the lowest risk time to plant, or now is the lowest risk time to apply a fertilizer, and so on and so forth. Because if you apply some of these things, like say fertilizer, and there's not enough moisture, you can actually damage your crop. And so, leveraging some of this remote sensing, I think, is
how
the
much
next
of that
level.
do we have that? I mean, when you talk about the satellites for the remote sensing, to what extent are we deploying that?
It's still relatively early days. We've been doing some extensive work in that area. We've actually, over the last 3 years, monitored about 6,000 square kilometers in northern Nigeria, and basically been developing the algorithms that will enable us to predict some of these things.
You say nobody else is doing this? No other
in Nigeria? To my knowledge, no.
So we don't have that technology yet?
Correct. But coming soon.
Coming soon. Onyeka, would you like to add to that? Because I mean, I've read how it's transforming agriculture in some other African countries, and I just wonder, why don't we have that technology here yet? I mean, it's good about you're doing that, but I'm just thinking that could help, to a large extent, help farmers prepare for adverse weather conditions.
Yes, you're very right about that. And anyone, I'm excited that Babban is doing that. Anyone that builds that technology is able to help many farmers across the country. From our own end, what we're doing now is building how we will disseminate that information to the farmers. And so we're building technology around USSD codes, which is helping farmers with feature phones, because many of them don't have smartphones to start downloading the apps. And so we're building that technology now. Recently, in partnership with the likes of GSME, we're working with them to build something that will allow thousands of farmers in the country to now access the information we can get from the likes of the Babban or any other company that is focused around providing that particular information to the farmers. Also, it's also technology that will allow us to manage the farmer's work on the farm to increase his yield. Because in our experience, we've noticed that dedication to the work the farmers do on the farm from a technical field specialist point of view will help grow the output you get at the end of the harvest season. And it's just simple information like when to put fertilizer, what kind of fertilizer to put in the ground, how do you plant your seeds, where do you position yourself when it comes to weeding, when should you go to the farm or when should you leave the farm, when you predict rain will fall based on geographical information you can get from satellite information you can get online and data you can get online. All these little pockets of information have its own effect in growing the output that you get from the farmer and slightly will increase his yield for harvest. So that's where we focus now in FarmCrowdy, and maybe by the end of the year we'll deploy some of these technologies to farmers. We'll try it out with a couple of thousands of farmers, and in that model, when we fine-tune it, we then scale it into helping or commercialize it to other farmers to see how they too can benefit as a result of that.
So obviously another good question would be how we can replicate this and ensure that, because I'm also thinking private sector also investment. What kind of, I mean, why can't we get investments coming into this space to focus on one or two technologies or more that would impact on different areas of the agriculture value chain?
Well, I think one of the critical challenges that's inhibited investment coming into space is the fragmentation, right? You've got millions of smallholder farmers that if individual companies and organizations to reach, the cost to serve them is cost prohibitive. And I think one of the benefits that we're seeing with the work that we're doing with Babban Gona is today, we're playing a key role to help reduce that cost to serve and enabling other players, other investors, other service providers to be able to reach these farmers in a much more cost-effective manner, which is a win-win for the farmer and the private sector company. So examples include, if you look at, say, capital, right? We've been able to go out and raise millions of dollars from organizations that do not typically fund smallholder farmers because we've been able to de-risk the farmers, create a very efficient channel to reach them. Take, for example, other service providers. We have service providers today that have hundreds of tractors that are actually now able to service our farmers cost effectively because of the systems and structures that we put in place. Before, they'd have to go and chase each individual farmer to try and get a deal, when we can basically give them access to 30,000 farmers like that. So these types of plays, I think, will be critical to unlocking the potential for the sector for many, many actors.
Now, Onyeka, we've talked about how many of the initiatives of government has helped the agriculture sector. We mentioned Bank of Industry, the CBN's Anchor Borrowers program. But as far as technology is concerned, to help us leapfrog and to help us stay ahead of population growth, I mean, it would appear that, these technologies, like what you're doing, what Babban Gona is also doing, they're just few. I mean, if you look at the population of farmers and if you talk about food security and our own population growth. So do you see more technology coming into this space? And
Yes, I do. When I talk about technology and its place in Nigeria, the first, maybe biggest technology platform, online technology platform that raised some funding happened maybe 8 years ago. With the likes of in the e-commerce space, and then that started getting people excited, and then the ecosystem started building. We're still in very early days. That there's a FarmCrowdy today doesn't mean that in 10 years it will still be one FarmCrowdy.
But there's a sense of urgency right now. What's going on the climate change in the north?
The truth is that this sense of urgency has always been there. The technology itself, as much as it's going to leapfrog and help grow and make things easier and more accessible for people to use in solving some of these problems, we cannot go faster than how much investment has gone into technology in the country. It's still 8 years. It's just been 8 years of pushing some of the platforms and getting young people excited about online technologies. FarmCrowdy is barely 17 months old. Eventually, as soon as FarmCrowdy launched, we started having other platforms come up similar to FarmCrowdy, and then trying to do one or two other things in the value chain. In itself, we're still in the early days, and maybe there are still very few platforms. Eventually, other technologies will evolve, and people will solve problems across the value chain, and it will gradually start becoming an ecosystem that is rich enough to thrive and solve the problems we want, but maybe not in the next 2 years, maybe not in the next 5 years.
Because the population growth is not waiting for all of that to. While that's good, how concerned are you, Kola, that we may not be able to outpace population growth? Because when I see the statistics, they're quite frightening. I know we have a bunch of good storage of seeds and all of that, but we'll talk about the kind of population growth we're looking at in Africa is almost frightening.
No, it's a very real concern. I think it's one of the reasons why, from our perspective, we've been focused aggressively on trying to develop systems that are highly scalable. Right, we've grown 6x in 2 years. Right, our expectations are to grow 10x in the next 2 years. On top of that, we're also investing very heavily on the technology side. We've got over half a dozen software engineers on staff that are working to develop technologies and systems that will enable similar type models to even grow faster. For us personally, we'd love a situation where by 2030 we could impact close to 30 million farmers.
Perhaps have more platforms like Babban Gona and FarmCrowd. I guess that is the bottom line, to have more of this so that we can scale and get to the promised land in quotes faster. Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for talking to us today. Pleasure having you. That was Kola Masha, Managing Director, Babban Gona, and Onyeka Akumah, co-founder and CEO of FarmCrowd.